Vince Cable, a very good morning to you, Mr. Cable. And the centrepiece, some might say, of this manifesto is this promise to take people earning £10,000 or less out of tax altogether. But you talked a lot about fairness at this manifesto launch. How is that fair that someone earning £90,000 will do better out of that cut?
Well, they would get the £700 a year, which everybody gets as a result of raising the threshold at the bottom. But of course, if they are very high earners, they would be paying in other ways. They would, if they've got a very large pension pot, they'll be no longer getting tax relief. If they fly a lot, they will be paying more in aviation duty. But Mr. Cable, no.
If they're earning under £100,000 and they're paying tax at 40%, that's £10,000 at 40% taken out of tax. That's better. You're doing better then than somebody earning £8,000 or £9,000.
No, we're not talking about changing the tax regime for the upper rate taxpayers. This purely lifting the threshold for the standard rate. So it is actually £700 for every earner. And as I said, if you're a very high earner, if you have a very large pension pot, you would lose quite a lot of tax relief, and this particular individual, hypothetical individual, would almost certainly be in that position. And if they've got a clever tax accountant who is routing their income through capital in order to pay much lower rates of capital gains tax, they would pay in that way. If their £90,000 income has enabled them to acquire a mortgage to buy a mansion, they would pay a mansion tax. So overall, the tax package is much fairer than the tax system we have at the moment. And it will benefit people on average income and low incomes in particular.
And costed, what, £17 billion a year?
That's correct, yes.
So over the course of a 5-year parliament, what, £85 billion, which moves the goalposts, really, doesn't it, in terms of your ambition to tackle the deficit? But that's all fully costed.
It is indeed, yes. The tax package stand on its own. There is a tax cut. It's lifting the threshold up to 10,000, so people under 10,000 don't pay any income tax, and £700 for other earners. But that's fully paid for in the ways that I've described. In terms of dealing with the deficit, we've been much more explicit than other parties about how you do it. We've identified a list of £15 billion of cuts in public spending, and it includes a small tax increase, which is the levy on the banks. And of that 15 billion, 5 billion is set aside for job creation in the next financial year, and beyond that, predominantly investment in education.
And you've got, what, 4 billion plus out of closing tax avoidance measures. And Mr. Clegg, when asked about that today, said part of this would be, for instance, stopping corporations listing properties overseas to avoid stamp duty. If it's that easy to do, and he said it could be quite easily done, why aren't the Treasury doing it now? Have they been missing a trick?
Well, partly because they chose not to deal with that particular problem, which has been well advertised.
Why would they choose not to when we're strapped for cash?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that in one of Gordon Brown's rather imprudent moods a couple of years ago, he slashed the staff of the Inland Revenue. It was, penny wise but pound foolish, and they didn't have the resources to deal with it. There are potentially, of course, vast sums of money that could be saved by reducing tax avoidance, and the Inland Revenue have come up with much, much bigger numbers than we are advocating. We're just talking about one or two specific things that could usefully be done, and you've highlighted one of them. A lot of individuals are able to avoid, rich individuals are able to avoid paying stamp duty by putting their property into a company. Companies are able to avoid stamp duty land tax by routing it through tax havens. There is a widespread practice in the city whereby some of the big banks, Barclays Capital, for example, earn vast fee income by advising companies how to avoid paying UK tax. And what we suggest in future, those practices should be assumed to be illegal unless they've got prior clearance, and if they get prior clearance, they've got to pay a full commercial rate for the advice they received for the Inland Revenue. So these are tangible proposals.
So presumably, just listening to that, tax specialists at HM Customs and Revenue will be safe and secure in their jobs under the Lib Dems, but presumably there'll be big cuts elsewhere in terms of jobs in the public sector?
Well, there would be cuts in the public sector. Yes, that is an inevitable consequence of some of the things we're proposing. If you get rid of the tiers of bureaucracy which oversee local government, there is no need, there's no role for them. What we want to see, however, is employment increasing in the UK. That's why we've set aside part of our savings for job creation. But in the long run, the growth of employment's got to come from the private sector. and it's got to come from small, medium-sized companies. And an absolutely key element of our thinking is ensuring that the banks who have been rescued by the British taxpayer are required to lend to sound British companies. I'm meeting examples every day of the week of British companies that want to take on workers, but they can't do it because they can't get credit from the banking system. That's got to be dealt with urgently.
And relatively briefly, Mr. Cable, can you tell us why splitting up the banks will help the UK taxpayer get their money back sooner rather than later?
Well, it will make the banks safer. That's the objective. It's not my technical judgment. It's the view of the Governor of the Bank of England and his colleagues, who are very seriously worried that we're going back to business as usual. We could easily recreate the conditions which led to this crash. And let's not forget that Britain, as a country, is much more dependent on the big international banks than other countries. Our banking system, when it's going fine, does earn a lot of revenue for the country.
Okay.
But it's also dangerous, and it needs to be dealt with.
Mr. Cable, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vince Cable from the Lib Dems. Much more politics coming up.
Damien Hirst.